Your retirement savings, which is typically a person's largest financial asset, is also usually an investment you have little control over. Members have to put their faith in trustees to protect their interests at the investment committee level, as they cannot see their money, how it's invested, who controls it, and what return it has earned. One just has to trust that all is well with their savings and retirement plans. This faith is put to the test by reports of fraudulent investment schemes that leave many pensioners destitute. And we don't have to look too far afield to international cases such as the Madoff Ponzi scheme, which made off with more than 44 million euros of pensioners' money back in 2008. Or the notorious Robert Maxwell of the Mirror Group, who plundered over 440 million pounds, that is the equivalent of over 4 billion pula, of the company's retirement funds. Just next door in South Africa, fund trustees and principal officers have learned hard lessons from cases such as the Peter Gavalis surplus stripping scandal from 20 years ago, which saw 748 million rand only returned to affected funds in 2006. Simon Nash, CEO of the engineering company KDAC, also gave pensioners a long wait. The Financial Services Board brought charges against him for using money from his KDAC fund to pay legal bills and surplus stripping two other funds back in the 1990s. This followed the Fidentia scandal, where more than 689 million rand was allegedly plundered, leaving widows and orphans of mine workers starving in the mid-2000s. Locally, apart from reports here and there of people walking away from their retirement funds just months before they mature because of a lack of understanding or poor communication, Botswana has yet to witness such far-reaching scandals. And this is despite the fact that until recently, stakeholders were operating under the broad guidance of the Pensions and Providence Act that was drafted all the way back in 1987. One can only imagine the repercussions had we not been so fortunate, with Mbifira recording membership of funds such as the Botswana Public Officers Pension Fund to be over 11,000 members back in 2012, and their assets recorded at over 45 billion pula last year. Can you imagine that for funds such as the Botswana Pension Fund, which recorded a total fund size of 5,541 billion pula for the year ending 2014, were being managed under regulations that were formulated almost 30 years ago? Parliament, around this time last year, approved the Retirement Funds Bill of 2014, which will repeal the Pension and Providence Act and reenact it under a new name, the Retirement Funds Act. It empowers the non-bank financial institutions regulatory authority, Mbifira, to exercise better supervision over retirement funds in terms of risk-based oversight, investment of fund assets, participation of members in the affairs of a fund, transparency of fund to members, clear objectives to trustees, as well as the management of fund contributions. The objectives of the bill are said to, quote, include for the provision of a framework that outlines the governance of the administrators of funds and ensures that investments are approved and guarded by the Mbifira in a modus that protects members' interests. Jeremy Andrew, a consulting actuary from South Africa, who has been part of efforts stemming from the World Bank to improve the regulation of retirement funds in the region, and who has also consulted on the new regulations to be enacted locally, sits down with us to share what these developments will look like and what they mean for all involved.
The critical thing really goes all around governance. That every fund should have a board, what that board should consist of in terms of members, member elected and employer sponsored or sponsor appointed members, what their duties are, how they have to act, the fact they must adopt a code of conduct, and that makes them do all the things that in the common law they were expected to do, but it spells it out in legislation. That it spells out all their duties in quite a lot of detail, and critically that goes into the whole area of the management of administrators, investment managers, actuaries, auditors and so on, to make sure that they're getting good value and that all the people are acting in the best interests of members. We've put in a fiduciary duty now on all those service providers, so your administrators now, your investment managers must do what's in the best interest of the fund and its members. So it's really been around governance, and that ties in with the Inbofera prudential rules, which spells out, in fact, what trustees must do. Have various policies like a risk management policy, a communication policy, investment policy. So it's really bringing all of that together and making sure that the Pension Fund Act, or the Retirement Funds Act as it's now, that empowers the regulator to do all the things the regulator needs to do for risk-based supervision. So that's what we tried to do.
As to the implications for various stakeholders, our guest details what to expect from the coming transition period.
Well, they're going to have a transition process. So they're going to have 6 months in which to get a license or be relicensed. Boards will have 12 months to comply. That would be in terms of the composition of the board and various other governance provisions. That should be relatively easy. So if you were licensed before, you'll continue to be licensed, but you'll have a period of time in which to comply. I think there will be quite a fair amount of implications in terms of doing things differently, because they'll have to have all these policies, and I think that they're going to find that the work they then have to do is going to be rather different. And the fact now that you need to take new things into account, like who is factually dependent on the deceased member. So if you were providing support to anyone, whether it's a child born out of wedlock, whether it's to a partner or something like that, you've now got this new concept of a factual dependent. You've got to take account of people who might become dependent but weren't, such as, for example, a parent, an indigent parent. So, you've got a whole lot of things like that. Then the board has to decide how to fairly distribute that lump sum death benefit. And my experience in South Africa is that is a very significant job for trustees to do. And they perform an enormously valuable role in a society in which a lot of people don't have wills. There's a lot of, I learned a new term here in Botswana of small households, which I wasn't aware of before, but at any rate, it will really bring the trustees into sorting out the distribution of monies between all of that.
Why should you care or even pay attention to the new regulations for retirement funds? Our guest Jeremy elaborates on the significance of the new Retirement Act.
Nearly all your funds in Botswana are defined contribution funds. So fixed amounts of money are going in as a percentage of payroll, and those are growing with investment return, less expenses, to a pot of money on retirement, which you then use, for example, to buy a pension of some form. Now, in that, the management of expenses become critical. And these measures will try to ensure that the governance of the fund is such that they get good benefit for the cost that they spend. So it should ultimately then benefit the members.
So often we hear how Botswana has great policies on paper, but suffers from a lack of implementation. What challenges does our guest foresee for the implementation of this new act?
I think that there will be a lot of learning. I think that trustees will find they're doing some things that they haven't done before. They really are going to have to put on a hat completely independent of the fact of whether they were a worker elected as a trustee or a trade unionist appointed by the trade union or appointed by the employer. They're now going to have to become a trustee and work as a trustee in the sole interest of the fund and its members.
Evidently, the regulators are doing their part, but how can we as the end consumers ensure that we protect an important and decades-long investment such as our pension?
Well, the critical thing here now, your trustees must communicate with you. There are a number of times in which that becomes obligatory. They must communicate in a language you can be expected to understand, and that must be comprehensive. So you must get full details of what's there. And the whole purpose of that is to empower the consumer to understand much more about what their benefits are, what they can expect, and how their fund is going along the way, how it's building up. Then we've introduced various things that with certain sorts of funds, the consumer would be able to uplift their portion and move it somewhere else without any penalty. And so there are restricted criteria under which that would apply. But there are certainly measures like that that should protect the consumer's interest.
That's what we had on the new Retirement Funds Act. Up next, my co-presenter Bonola Moletsane takes you through our second offering of the evening.
Welcome back to First Issues. The Botswana Economic Hubs are a result of the Botswana Strategy for Excellence, labeled a Strategy for Diversification and Sustainable Growth, released in the year 2008 by the Government Implementation Coordination Office, GECO, that was recently renamed National Strategy Office in the year 2010. The Education Hub, Health Hub, Agriculture Hub, Diamond Hub, Innovation Hub, and Transport Hub were all established to diversify economic growth and development within Botswana. These hubs were also aimed at diversifying economic activities in order to improve and diversify sustainability, which would result in alternative revenues from mining. Tonight, we are pleased to host Research Manager Mr. Moatlhudi Sebabole and notable economist Dr. Keith Jeffries, who take us through the significant economic growth that the establishment of these hubs has brought about in fulfilling their various mandates and specific roles. Have jobs been created since? And what other signs of progress are evident since the establishment of these hubs?
Ideally, what you want to do, or the indicators you want to look at, is the return on investment that you are making towards this hub. Like I've indicated, you are looking at economic diversification. So in there, the idea is to push in for full employment, so that we actually see translate into where you see unemployment rates coming down. So you want to have a hub that will then achieve full employment where there is job creation. You also want to see a situation where now you have got more trade activities or interaction with other markets. Say for the likes of you have got more trade routes to access your international markets that you participate in. You want to see the likes of your agriculture industry as an example, your exports within beef, expanding in the manufacturing process, the value chain from the whole manufacturing process, where maybe now you create glue from cow heels as an example, or you do jewelry from horns as an example. It's an example of what you really want to achieve.
It's quite difficult to pin down indicators that will relate specifically to the hubs, because, I mean, let's say we have something like the agricultural hub. We would obviously hope that initiative would lead to improved growth and output in the agricultural sector, but of course there's lots of other things happening in agriculture which may or may not be anything to do with the hub. So I think it's quite difficult to isolate the specific impact of the hubs themselves, rather than broader initiatives, investments, policy reforms that will be taking place in that area. But we would certainly hope to see faster growth in the areas where the hubs are active.
It obviously takes a bit of time to actually get to a point where you realize that return on investment. So at the moment you might see there has not been that huge return on investment coming through, because it's at early stages where you are driving growth, you are driving expansion, you are driving penetration, more than you're actually now starting to see the result reflecting. So I think as a country we're at a stage where we are spending more towards that, so that we achieve that in a later stage. Maybe in the medium to long term we'll start to see actually that coming, that starting to reflect in the numbers that we see as far as employment is concerned, as far as national output is concerned, as far as our trade activities with other markets such as in Europe or in China or in South Africa, or even our presence generally as an export market instead of a net importer of almost all the essentials.
What distinctions can you draw from being able to determine that there actually has been an effective implementation of these processes?
You obviously have got to look at the system that is put in place, or the connection that is being put in place. If you look at the investment in certain infrastructures, for the likes of other institutions or parastatals such as Botswana Investment Trade Center, BITC, the sole reason of that, obviously, we are looking at still economic diversification and driving for foreign direct investments. So those institutions have been set up to make the environment conducive. You make the environment conducive for businesses, so that then businesses are attracted to come to the country and then invest in these ideas that you are trying to put forward through the likes of your innovation hub. There's a lot going on towards research, a lot going on towards science and technology, a lot of investment also going on towards improving the technology or communication networks within the country, because then these are the other enablers that will then see you moving forward. So I think the creation of this kind of enablers around the country, or even the special economic zones that are now being pushed forward to make sure that we maximize on different regions that we have the country, are the kind of enablers that we actually need to see them reflecting on the hubs that are being set up and what gets achieved at the end of the day.
There have indeed been signs of progress, as the various hubs that have been set up have brought about infrastructural development and construction. A notable example is the Botswana Investment Trade Center that has been established as an enabler to create a conducive business environment for business people and attract investors. Another example that can be taken into account is the special economic zones that have been set up to ease commercialization and business trade among business owners and improving access to foreign markets of local traders. What indicators can we look to that show significant contribution to the economic growth rate and development in Botswana since the establishment of these hubs?
I think there actually needs to be more clarity on what the different hubs are doing, because although we have this title of hubs, actually they're quite different, so they're not all the same. So if we look at, say, the Innovation Hub, that is going to be very focused upon a physical development which is taking place, as I'm sure you're aware, up around the airport. There's a site, some construction going on, and so the Innovation Hub is going to be a physical location backed up by some, say, some tax concessions, etc., and some support, but a physical location for innovative activities, whereas some of the other hubs are not so much a physical location. So the Agriculture Hub is not a physical location, it's more about a set of policies and other interventions. And I think sometimes this is not well appreciated, that actually there's not a uniform model for the hubs. But I think there needs to be more clarity, perhaps, over what exactly the hubs are doing. But to me, what I think is being missed is that there's probably too much focus on the hubs being physical things, whereas to my mind what they should focus on is the hub really, above all else, should be a link between government and the private sector. So if we're trying to encourage investment in these particular activities, whether it be education services or diamond beneficiation or innovation, ultimately that investment is going to come from the private sector. The entrepreneurial activity is going to come from the private sector. So the hub should really be about making sure that there's a conducive environment for investment in those areas. So if there's a need for supporting infrastructure, then the hub can be the link between the firms or the entrepreneurs in those areas and the governments that can be providing the infrastructure. So I think that using the hubs to provide that link and if you like, smoothen the path for investors should really be the focus of the hub activities, and it probably hasn't had enough focus up to now.
It's now time for Stock Market Review, courtesy of Botswana Stock Exchange.
Good evening. A short glimpse at how the markets performed in the past week. Our domestic company index, or DCI, depreciated by 0.5% in the past week, whereas the foreign company index, or FCI, went down by 1.6%. On a year-to-date basis, our DCI has gained 16.2%, which is very impressive compared to an appreciation of 3.8% in the same period in 2014. If you look at the FCI performance so far in 2015, it has gone down by 0.4% compared to a slight appreciation of 0.1% in the same time in 2014. In the past week, we traded a total turnover of 137.3 million shares compared to about 104 million Pula worth of shares in the previous week, which means that in the past week, the total number of shares that exchanged hands amongst the investor base amounted to 22 million shares in comparison to about 20 million in the previous week. The overall performance of the BSE so far in 2015 has been very impressive, with a total turnover of 1.9 billion Pula compared to about 1.5 billion Pula in the same period in 2014. Looking at how the companies have fared, our top three traded companies were Choppies, FNB and Engine. Choppies traded the total turnover of 95 million shares whereas FNB traded 22 million pula worth of shares, and the trades in engine amounted to 9.4 million pula. On the ETF for exchange-traded funds bought, we did not see any activity. Therefore, there was no movement in share prices or unit prices. The new gold ETF closed the week at 108 pula 90 tebe unit. The new plat closed the week at 100 pula 75 tebe, whereas the Beta ETF ended the week at 42 pula 20 tebe a unit. From the BSE, that's all we have for you.
This year's ICT Pitso began in Gaborone this morning and continues through tomorrow. It follows on from last year's Pitso, where the publication of the National Broadband Strategy, among other operational issues presented by operators and business alike, as well as the issue of a greater inclusion of groups such as young developers and the disabled in the drafting of ICT policies, topped the agenda. The then Minister of Transport and Communications, Nonofo Molefi, detailed how the country is tackling the key components in the liberalization of the ICT sector, being cost and accessibility. When we next meet, we investigate the progress made since the last meeting through conversations with the current Minister of Transport and Communications, Tsenolo Mabeo, and the CEO of Bokra, Tari Peko, amongst others.
Initially, it related to the liberalization of the playing field. We've made attempts at leveling the playing field by breaking BTC into two entities, BTCL and Bofinet. In doing so, we are addressing the issue of leveling the playing field by identifying cost, access as key components of the liberalization of the ICT sector.
Until then, the First Issues team wishes you a good night and pleasant viewing.